Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those on the West Coast, and thanks for being here. I'm going to be presenting some findings from my CDA project, and I'm currently in my 4th year. The specific aspect of this part of the project is I'll be talking about the adapting a family-involved intervention. And the purpose of that intervention is to increase initiation and completion of evidence-based psychotherapy for veterans with PTSD. I'd like to acknowledge all the individuals who contributed to this work on this first slide. All right, Rob, next slide, please. All right, we're going to get started with some polls that I think Rob is going to help us with. So the first poll is, how often do you work with family members of veterans? And I'd like to kind of put an addendum to that. Part of it is how much of if you're exclusively a researcher and not a clinician, how much of your research is around family members of veterans?
That poll is open. Please, you'll see that both polls today are on the same, both questions are on the same poll. Please answer just the first one for now. We'll run the second one in a moment. We'll leave things open for a few more seconds. Make sure people have enough time. Well, not everyone has submitted their answers to the question, but it looks like things have leveled off. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll momentarily, which I'll do now. And then I will share out the results. And we see that, a second please, I need to change my view. 20% answered all the time. Another 20%, I'm sorry, 15% answered B some of the time, and 15% answered C rarely. Things are changing a little bit, I'm sorry. 10% answered D never, and that's it. Shall we move on to the next poll?
Sure, great. All right.
It looks like some people have already started with that.
Yeah.
Good.
Do we need to change the slide?
Yep, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So the second question is, how comfortable do you feel working with family members of veterans, or how comfortable do you feel in the realm of family-based research?
That poll is open, and it looks like people are answering a little bit quicker this time around. Answer options: very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, not at all comfortable. And attendees, I have to apologize for my voice today. I have a slight cold, and I just can't get rid of the congestion, so I apologize for sounding all stuffed up. Close the poll results for the first one, and then looks like people have submitted their answers, so I'm going to go ahead and share these out. And for this question, another 20% answered very comfortable, 20% again, B, somewhat comfortable. Only 5% say not at all comfortable, and we got a few no answers. And that's it for the poll. So I'm going to turn the moving of the slides over to you.
Wonderful. All right, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for, for giving us a sense of, kind of where you fall on this. The idea of working with family members of veterans, is gaining traction in VA. But I love that there's folks here who both are very familiar with this area and folks who are less so. So thank you everybody for being here. So for this presentation today, I'm going to start with the background and then move on to the rationale, talk about the process that we undertook to actually adapt the intervention. And then we piloted the intervention. So I'll give you just some teasers on some of that, that feedback, as some of that is still under analysis. and then just talk about conclusions and next steps for this project more broadly. So we all know that for veterans, PTSD can be really problematic. It's prevalent among returning veterans. One study found that 23% of OEF, OIF veterans in the community, had a PTSD diagnosis or met clinical threshold for PTSD. And PTSD for some folks can confer pretty substantial health and social risks. And so for this reason, VA has tried really hard to adopt and disseminate evidence-based psychotherapies. And the focus of for this study is really prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, though I do recognize that there are more EBPs than just these two. So fairly recent work by Megan and colleagues found that among veterans in the VA system who have a PTSD diagnosis, 23% used either of these EBPs at least once, and only 9% completed an adequate dose. And this is important because an adequate dose has really been shown to be the important precursor for reduced symptoms. And so there have been a lot of efforts to try to think about how to increase use and completion of these EBPs. And so there have been a lot of different things that have been tried at the provider level, at the veteran level. And again, one thing that's sort of, gaining thought and getting a little bit more research around it is to think about whether support from family members or friends might be able to increase the use of these effective therapies. So there is research that shows that this could be a potentially plausible intervention strategy to somehow involve family members to try to increase veteran engagement in these EBPs. Studies have shown that positive and empathetic family interactions might increase feelings of safety for individuals with PTSD, might increase the veteran's willingness to engage in treatment, and could even reinforce treatment gains. Contact between family members and providers is also associated with veterans' early treatment commitment, despite the patient's own treatment attitudes. And then I'm going to further provide some rationale for why this, is a potential treatment strategy or a strategy to increase engagement in these therapies through my own formative work as part of the CDA. So, the first couple years of the CDA were really spent collecting and analyzing data to try to help us understand how we should develop this intervention. So one of those projects involved semi-structured interviews with 18 US military veterans who had a PTSD diagnosis in the VA medical records and who had also been referred for therapy for PTSD within the VA. And this was a study nationally. This was not just individuals in Durham. So we contacted these 18 veterans, and we were able to also recruit 13 of their associated family members or friends. So we developed parallel interview scripts. So the scripts for the veterans and the family members were, slightly different, but had really similar topics. And essentially, we explored the role of the support partner or the family member in veteran treatment engagement. We analyzed the data using Hamilton's rapid content analysis approach and matrix analysis. So just to kind of clarify some semantics, I am using the term family member and support partner interchangeably. And part of that is that we recognize that people who support veterans in this way aren't always their direct family members. Oftentimes they're close friends, they're neighbors, and so we'll use the term support partner to try to be a little more inclusive. But I do refer to family members as well. So the research questions in this qualitative project were, how do family members or support partners influence why and when individuals with PTSD seek therapy? How do family members engage with the individual with PTSD who is seeking therapy? And do these interactions help or hinder the therapy process? So given that I'm going to try to cover a lot of information today, I'm just going to give some high-level conclusions. The findings for this paper or excuse me, the findings for this project are actually divided between two papers, one that's and both are under review right now. So, the high-level conclusions that came out of this is that, we found that family member involvement in PTSD therapy to be a dynamic bidirectional process. So, we had kind of thought that maybe family members would really be the ones exerting the influence on veterans, perhaps influencing their treatment attitudes, encouraging them to attend. But we actually found that there was this sort of bidirectional process where veterans also exerted an influence on the family member's own treatment attitudes. And in a couple situations, the family member also had a PTSD diagnosis. And so there were a couple examples of the veteran benefiting from treatment and actually encouraging their partner to go in and also get similar treatment. In terms of talking with veterans and their family members, they described how they made these treatment decisions together, that they kind of talked about the veteran's PTSD to a somewhat limited degree, but in the context of how, in some cases, it was really, could be disruptive in the family context. And so many of them talked about how they saw therapy as a way to actually help the family, that it was a shared family goal to help the veteran engage more in treatment. Aligning with other studies, positive family member attitudes towards therapy were really important for veteran enthusiasm towards treatment. So there really was sort of this family dynamic around treatment attitudes, and the attitudes towards one really influenced the attitudes of the other. We also found that non-judgmental conversations about PTSD and treatment promoted an emotional safety for the veteran while they were going through treatment. So I'll talk a little bit about how some of these findings influence the adaptations and the subsequent intervention that we developed. So the overall purpose of the CDA is to develop an adjunct intervention that leverages social support from family members and friends to increase veteran initiation and adherence to PTSD EBPs. I'm going to break that down a little bit. So what we're trying to develop is a clinical intervention that is adjunct. It's a separate intervention, but it can happen in conjunction with two EBPs. So specifically for this project, we're looking at prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. And this adjunct intervention is designed to leverage social support for veterans to engage in the treatment. And our end outcomes are both veteran initiation of treatment and adherence to treatment. So it was sort of this twofold outcome that we were interested in impacting in terms of how we design the intervention. So this was the process for intervention development. First we examined existing family-based interventions around PTSD to understand where we might contribute and to sort of build off of what other people have done. We adapted an intervention called REORDER that I'll talk more about for the PTSD population. And the entire time we were thinking about, ultimately, if this is feasible and people like it, how can we design this to optimize dissemination in the VA? Once we adapted REORDER, we designated the core components of our new intervention, developed a theoretical model and an intervention protocol, and then we tested the proof of concept through a small single group pilot. And again, I will get into all of this more, but that's an overview of our process. So, for those of you who work in this area, I'm sure you are familiar with, the really excellent work done by Sherman, Monson, McDonald, Mice, Thompson, Hollins, and many, many others. There's just a lot of energy that's gone into thinking about family-involved interventions for mental illness. And so what we did is we looked at this body of work to understand the structure of the interventions, the treatment strategies that people used, the goals and the target population, so we can understand where there might be gaps and opportunities for us to build on this work, but create something that also addressed, you know, other needs that weren't being addressed quite yet. We chose an intervention called REORDER as our starting point. This is an intervention that was developed by Shirley Glenn and Lisa Dixon, and it targets veterans with serious mental illness and their support partner. The goal of REORDER was to engage the support person in the mental health treatment team. And the structure is that this was this two-phased intervention. The first phase was with the veteran only, and they did a lot of shared decision making to try to get the veteran on board with inviting a support partner into the intervention. And only once the veteran was comfortable with that did they invite a support partner. REORDER was about 6 sessions. The sessions lasted 45 to 60 minutes. The sessions occurred in parallel to while the veteran was actually undergoing their own mental health treatment. And the veteran and the support partner never came together. There were separate sessions. The treatment strategies that they used include shared decision-making, motivational interviewing, and psychoeducation. So we took this structure and we took this treatment strategies and we really changed the goal and the content for a population with PTSD. As I'd mentioned, the entire time we were thinking that if this ultimately ends up being feasible, how can we optimize our ability to disseminate this in the VA system? So the adaptation process was guided by the Framework for Adaptations and Modification, or the FRAME, that was developed by Wiltz D. Sturman in 2019. And the FRAME is really an approach that allows one to systematically track and describe modifications. Her paper talks about how often adaptations to interventions are done ad hoc and reactively, but she and her colleagues really suggest using a very, very proactive way to transparently track the adaptations and think about why you're doing the adaptation. So it's a very intentional process. So these are the domains of FRAME. And so we use some of these guiding questions to adapt REORDER. So we thought about timing. Was the modification planned or unplanned or purposefulness? Who made the decisions? What did we modify? Was it the content? Was it the structure? Was it the population? We also thought about fidelity consistent modifications and the modifications that we made for REORDER. Then how did that translate into fidelity for our new intervention? What makes our new intervention distinct from other interventions? And I'll talk more about that later. So, the main adaptation that we did was really thinking about, how do we adapt this intervention that was originally for veterans with serious mental illness for veterans with PTSD. So we made changes to REORDER via the modification categories in FRAME, and these changes were informed by the literature review that I talked about in the beginning, where we just tried to understand the existing landscape of family-involved interventions for veterans with mental illness. We also, the information from the qualitative interviews with veterans and family members, those findings really helped us to refine our content. We then got input from Durham VA clinicians. We presented some of this on, some of the weekly calls with the Durham Trauma Recovery Program. And then we got input from the advisory board and also the Durham VA Veteran Engagement Research Panel. So we really tried to show kind of the big picture ideas around to people who represented multiple perspectives. The intervention that we got out of it is called FAMILIAR, or Family Support in Mental Health Recovery. So in this slide, I've put REORDER and FAMILIAR side by side, so you actually can see what changed. So, as I'd mentioned, the target audience changed. We were working with individuals with PTSD. And while REORDER's goal was to engage the support person with the mental health treatment team, our goal was different. It was veteran focused, and it was really to engage the veteran in PTSD EBPs. Both of the interventions use a veteran-directed approach, and we use treatment strategies, the same treatment strategies as REORDER. We also used a phased approach as REORDER did, though we included a booster session as well. We have fewer but longer sessions. And with REORDER, the REORDER sessions occurred while the veteran was in treatment. But for familiar, we actually start familiar before the veteran gets into treatment to help leverage them to, sort of try to span that transition from when they're referred to when they actually begin. So we come in right as they're on the wait list, and try to kind of keep them engaged so that they'll actually begin treatment. Both of these interventions, were designed to be offered in a clinic, in the clinic by a trained mental health provider. For familiar though, delivery is adaptable. It can be. We actually presented it virtually because we were in a pandemic when we were piloting it, but it actually could be adapted to be given in person, and that was something that some of the veterans who participated in the pilot said they wanted. So once we kind of had the structure for this intervention, we developed a theoretical model that then we used to kind of really help refine the content. We also developed from that the intervention protocol that right now is very scripted, just so that we could, make sure that we were really adhering to the protocol when we were piloting it. And we distinguish the core components. And the core components are how do you assess fidelity to familiar? What has to happen for familiar to be familiar? What can't be changed? So this is the theoretical model that underpins the familiar intervention. It's based on the theory of planned behavior. And so essentially you see this triangle at the top where we've got the familiar intervention. And the familiar intervention is supposed to intervene on veteran treatment attitudes and on subjective norms by involving the family member. And it's supposed to address, to some extent, barriers and facilitators, which could be family accommodation and family member self-efficacy. And the idea is that if we can successfully intervene on attitudes, subjective norms, and barriers and facilitators, this will increase behavioral intention or the veteran's intention to participate in the EBPs, and it should increase the desired behavior. So the initiation, completion of PTSD EBP therapy. This was also informed by a lot of research. And so based on the research, we felt that family strain would be an important moderator. And these were the baseline confounders. And the theoretical model was helpful for us to determine content, but it was also helpful for us to develop our measures. So we collected measures about all of these constructs, which in retrospect, it was too many measures. So I'll just put that out there, but this was sort of the intent. So this is sort of the foundation and some of the core features of familiar. So this intervention is dyadic, and it is meant to have the veteran and the caregiver participate together. At the same time, it's veteran-centric. So this is one of the key core components. But some of the other foundational and sort of distinguishing features of familiar is that it's, we designed it to be flexible enough so that it can be generalized to any existing or newly approved PTSD therapy or other mental health therapy. It targets both use and completion of psychotherapy, and it really targets veterans who would benefit from family support, but who don't necessarily want their support partners engaged in their therapy. So then we piloted familiar. We delivered the intervention to 15 dyads. This was a single group. These were veterans with PTSD who'd been referred for a PTSD EBP through the Durham VA Trauma Recovery Program. And then we also recruited their support partner. Veterans did not have to have a support partner signed up to qualify for the intervention. So there were a couple veterans who participated on their own. We did quantitative assessments that corresponded with the conceptual model that I just showed you. And then we also conducted a qualitative exit interviews with each individual, so separately. So we interviewed veterans separately and caregivers, or their support partners separately. We then also conducted qualitative interviews with 8 VA mental health clinicians and leaders from across the VA system. So I'll show you some of the primary findings from that data collection. This was the session plan of Familiar. This is what we piloted. So you can see Familiar has 3 phases. Like REORDER, we start with phase 1 and with the veteran only. And the purpose of this phase 1 is to work with a veteran to understand what their treatment goals are. And that's how this is veteran-centered, is that the entire intervention is really around supporting the veteran's treatment goals. We also use shared decision-making here to try to activate them to invite a support partner to join. And these were the treatment strategies that we used. And I should say phase 1 and 2, as I mentioned, occur while the veteran is waiting for their EBP to begin. Phase 2 includes the veteran and their support partner, and then it consists of PTSD education, treatment education. The interventionist shared the veteran's treatment goals. That being said, the purpose of this intervention is not to go into the trauma, and so we did not probe about trauma. We were not addressing the trauma. We were simply trying to get veterans and their support partners on the same page about what the veteran needed to get through therapy. So we talked a little bit about managing expectations. What did the support partner think might happen over the course of therapy? Did they feel like therapy would fix all the family issues? And we also talked about communication skills, just so that the support partner was really clear about what to expect from therapy, and that they also could develop, just some small skills that might help them engage with the veteran in a way that felt supportive. So then during this part, the idea was that the veteran attended the first several sessions of their therapy. And then we brought them both in after sessions 3 to 5 of the EBP as kind of a booster session. So it was a check-in to see how treatment was going, problem solve if some of the action planning they did in phase 2 didn't really work, or if there were new challenges that had come up, try to problem solve those challenges and figure out together with the veteran and the support partner what the support partner could do to help the veteran, but in a way that also felt validating of the support partner. So here are some of the findings from the intervention. So I had mentioned we collected a lot of data. This is just a couple selected baseline statistics. And while in the paper, I don't think I'm going to compare those who completed the intervention to those who didn't, I thought it was kind of interesting to look at these potential differences. So we had actually 24 people who were consented into the study. 16 completed the intervention fully, and 8 did not complete. And several of these who didn't complete the intervention actually never started the intervention in the first place. But we're seeing qualitatively lower PCL scores among those who completed. We are not looking at statistically significant differences here because the sample size is just too small. But just descriptively, the PCL scores are about 10 points lower among those who completed Familiar. Interestingly, people who completed Familiar, only about 70% of them said that they've used PTSD medication in the past 12 months. And then we also administered a lot of scales around family functioning and family conflict. And again, it's really hard to know whether 69% versus 62%, like how different these are. But, this actually shows the McMaster score, and this percentage shows the percentage of people who are above 2, which indicates, family functioning. But certainly between 11 and 5, that seems like a pretty big difference in score. So if we think about what the actual threshold for family functioning is, that difference is probably not that big. But it's just interesting to kind of think about, who might be more successful at completing familiar, why, and what can we do to sort of target this group, or do we not target this group? These are just some questions I think for future applications. So as I'd mentioned, 24 people enrolled, 16 completed the intervention, 20 out of 24 initiated at least one EBP after completing the first session of familiar, and 11 out of 24 completed at least 8 EBP sessions within the 6 months after familiar. And we determined, just based on prior research, that 8 EBP sessions within 6 months was our criteria for an adequate dose, or for completion of the EBP. So here are some findings from the veteran exit interviews, and these are grouped based on the constructs in our behavioral and theoretical model. These are the positives and these are the negatives. So veterans found the intervention to be helpful for including their support partners in their care. They reported that the interventionist helped them and the support partner to communicate better about PTSD. And several said that communication actually went on after familiar ended, because we interviewed some of them, up to a month after familiar ended. They felt that the education about PTSD was helpful for their support partner to understand their PTSD and their treatment. On some of the kind of the negative sides, some of the veterans really had trouble distinguishing the intervention from clinical care, which doesn't end up being that big of a deal if this intervention is ultimately embedded in clinical care. A few people were sort of, their perception of the intervention was influenced because of challenges that they had around the VA. Challenges with marital conflict and veteran anger affected the intervention experience, which we actually anticipated, as we thought that family strain might be a moderator. A mediator. And then veterans, we had several veterans that had a history of MST, and they in particular seemed to struggle to engage the support of their partners in this intervention, particularly if that partner was a spouse. So that's something else to think about. This population of veterans with MST, do they need something different? So from support partners, they felt that the education components helped them understand the veterans' PTSD and choose communication and strategies to support them, which is, very similar perspective to what the veterans said. Several of the support partners felt that the intervention increased their intention to provide support to their veteran around their PTSD and treatment, and they valued the dyadic sessions for facilitating communication with their veteran. Some of these couples came out, and they weren't all couples, but most were couples, either partners or married. And a lot of these folks, that they've never talked to the veteran about their PTSD. And this just opened an opportunity in a safe and facilitated space to begin to talk about it. So on the negative side, a few of the support partners felt that the intervention was not helpful for them. Again, challenges with marital conflict and veteran anger affected the intervention experience. And some support partners just never really understood the goals of the intervention, and perhaps confused it with clinical care. And some conflated the intervention with the data that we collected, because it turned out that our data collection instrument was really burdensome to the participants. And for some of them, it was so burdensome that it really colored their experience of the entire study. So here are some illustrative quotes. One veteran said, "I learned I shouldn't hold stuff like I was taught to." Veteran 2 said, "The interventionist got stuff rolling, so after the sessions we could continue talking about it." Veteran 3 said, "The intervention showed me that this isn't my fault." And one of the support partners said, "We've had our disagreements, which is normal. He's part of my family. Now I can read him. I can tell if he needs to chill out a little bit." We also asked participants what they would add or change. Veterans wanted more education on available treatments, including other additional therapies and medications. They wanted more dyadic sessions. They really seemed to like those. They wanted the intervention to be integrated into the trauma recovery program. All of this, as I'd mentioned, was conducted virtually. People said they actually wanted to do this face-to-face. The support partners expressed a desire for more skills and more tools around veteran care and their own self-care. So we also, as I mentioned, interviewed 8 providers and mental health leaders around the VA and described the familiar intervention to them and asked them what they thought were the advantages and disadvantages about our approach. In terms of the advantages, they really liked that the protocol could be adopted to other processes of care. They felt that it was a structured way to involve families that's separate from the EBP protocol, so the family members don't actually need to be involved in treatment. They felt that it was helpful for family members to know what to expect during and after treatment. And they also felt that for the therapist side, learning about the family could provide insight into the context surrounding the veteran's PTSD. In terms of disadvantages, they also pointed out, as we saw, that it may be hard for distressed couples, particularly in cases where there was potential for abuse or an abusive dynamic. We did have a whole protocol to try to address this, including our timing around when we involved a support partner, and we always had a time alone with the support partner with the interventionist, who was a trained clinical social worker, to ask, not if there were necessarily instances of abuse, but did they feel safe participating in this intervention? And we had one person who declined to participate after that conversation. They, some of there is a perception, and I don't know if this is from some, recent studies that have come out, but there have been some studies showing that pre-treatment sessions or quote unquote treatment readiness sessions might lead to higher dropout because veterans have a certain number of sessions in them. So while this concern wasn't necessarily expressed by the providers we spoke with, they thought that this might be a perception among providers more globally, that adding sessions, in addition to this EBP protocol could actually lead to higher dropout. And then, of course, there's always challenges when we're thinking about, how do we account for therapist time? Because if a therapist is giving these sessions, how do we count that towards their, the time that they're caring for veterans? There's going to need to be some creative thought put into how to actually operationalize this. And so I should say that these provider interviews were ongoing as we were piloting our intervention. And so the adaptation of the intervention was extremely iterative, and we actually had an opportunity to take some of the insights from these interviews and adapt the protocol as we were piloting it. So a lot of this actually has already been incorporated. All right, finally, conclusions and next steps. So generally familiar was acceptable to veterans and their family members. Most of the dyads who enrolled ended up completing familiar. So as you recall, 16 out of 24 who enrolled completed familiar. The providers that we spoke with recognized the challenges of offering new family-involved interventions but they also discussed many benefits. This familiar, while there are other family-involved interventions, what's unique about familiar is the combination of the fact that it's dyad-focused, it's short, it's not part of the EBP protocol, which can offer veterans privacy in their treatment. And it's also a very flexible protocol that could be adapted for other conditions. So, we recognize that, there is definitely, there is excellent couples-based PTSD therapy developed by Dr. Monson and her colleagues. And then Dr. Mice has also developed a family-involved PE protocol. And there, I think is room for all of these different types of approaches, understanding that veterans want choice and that VA strives to give them choice. And what familiar can offer is, a brief intervention for veterans who they or their partners don't necessarily have or want to spend a ton of time, but it's an introduction. It's, to PTSD and the world of PTSD treatments for veterans and a family member or support partner that's brief and that kind of supports the process of treatment while veterans are going through it, but is still distinct from treatment. So in terms of next steps, we do need to do a little bit more to examine the plausibility and the potential to improve intended outcomes. So we need to think about whether that's comparing our outcomes to, people in our sample and their rates of starting EBPs and completing EBPs to national statistics, or whether we compare that to clinic level data in Durham. We're still trying to figure out the best way forward. We also want to conduct a feasibility trial of familiar in the intended clinical setting. And so what that would do is really help us understand, how does this fit into the workflow? What does it feel like for clinicians to actually implement it and to use it? The person who did our pilot, she's a trained clinical social worker, but she was an interventionist. So she wasn't also working as a therapist at the VA, for example. And then if all this goes well, then we want to apply for funding for an efficacy trial to understand, does this intervention have promote superior outcomes, higher rates of EBP, starting an EBP and completing an EBP compared with usual care or some other intervention. So I'd like to acknowledge the advisory board members and others who provided input. The folks on the first page who are co-authors on this work, many of them are clinicians at the Durham VA who reviewed the protocol script in great depth. I'm very grateful to all these people. This has been a tremendous team effort. This is one of the papers that has already been published about this adaptation process. It's in Social Science and Medicine and Mental Health. I actually think that's come out now, and then other findings presented here are under review. And I think, yep, here's my contact information. I, definitely welcome questions and comments. I just think this work can be made stronger. So thank you so much for your time and attention. And, I look forward to answering your questions and having a robust discussion.
We don't have any questions right now at this very moment. Often it takes a few minutes for people to craft their questions and send them in. You did have, in an earlier slide presentation that I saw, you had some questions that you thought you might want them to consider. And I posted those to the chat, so people may be reading that now.
Great. And, I actually was sort of brainstorming. I felt like those were a little more for a clinical audience. And so, some other questions that I've got for folks are there any glaring gaps that you see? Are there things that we haven't considered? And then, I'd also love to hear what folks found helpful, like for those who are not, involved in kind of family services work, but more the adaptation process. What did you find helpful, or what are some key takeaways, and what are some questions that you still have that wasn't answered as I talked about the adaptation. So I can put those in the chat too.
Attendees, if you'd like to answer some of those questions. Oh, here's one. That you actually asked that question.
Yeah, that's me. That's me.
Right. Dr. Shepherd-Banigan would definitely like to hear from you if you have questions based on the presentation today, or if you would like
folks
to.
Are welcome to, chat answers to these questions too.
As much as I do hate dead air, I think we should give people a few more moments to consider the questions that I posted through the chat and yours, and see if they have questions to send in. Unfortunately, we're not getting any responses, Dr. Shepherd-Banigan. Do you have closing comments you'd like to make?
No worries. Yeah. Again, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. And, I think moving forward, this is a really exciting, both the adaptation process, the intervention adaptation process, but also thinking about how we can engage family members is just a really, really exciting area in VA right now. I do a lot of work as well around family caregivers, which I see as a separate line of work from this, but yeah, and so we're always open to thinking about collaborations and just different ways that we can come together and connect, because I think family support and family caregivers is just something that cuts across almost everything that we do at VA. So yeah, so I think that is it, and again, thank you so much.
I think we did get one question in. This person asks, did you notice other attitudes / concerns among clinicians regarding involving family? It can be complicated and take a lot of time. Any other thoughts on that?
Yes. Yes, there was so much more that the provider said that I just didn't feel like I had time. There's a lot of concerns about privacy. There's a lot of concerns about ensuring that both the veteran and the family member are on the same page. And I know some providers some providers were concerned that there are providers who don't necessarily feel like they've been trained enough. And so one of the big things that we got out of kind of the potential takeaways for us is the need to develop a really simple kind of set of procedures for clinicians who aren't used to working with family members, but would like to try this because they either see a need or they've been asked to by the veterans. So just, I don't know, I think it would be really helpful to kind of just develop some sort of SOP to, what is the 101 of engaging with family members, and, thinking about the different considerations. Because it's not easy at the family, provider, and then also the system level, because we're just not necessarily set up for that.
Attendees, if you have questions and you can't see the Q&A panel, click on the ellipsis button at the very far lower right-hand corner. You'll see Q&A in a submenu. Click on that, and a blue checkmark will appear next to Q&A, and then the Q&A panel will appear to the right of the slides. We did get another question in, Dr. Shepherd-Banigan. Can you speak to any of the challenges with implementation of this program that you might encounter or anticipate, and how they might be overcome?
Right, that's a great. So we are actually right now, the head of the Durham TRP has been an active partner in this. And so we are in the midst of kind of starting those conversations with Durham about what it means to engage in something like this. I think some of the biggest implementation barriers are going to be uptake, maybe on the provider side. Because if it's just not well, the feedback I got from clinicians, if it's not well structured and not clear, it's just a lot of energy to do it. So I think to address that particular implementation, challenge, what we're really going to need to do is have some sort of, whether it's a grab and go like packet of actually how you do this that's very simple and straightforward. So that's one thing. The other thing is really around kind of not reimbursement, but like, how people, how clinicians kind of get, can sort of bill their time in VA. And I know some VAs, there's just different ways that VAs have gotten around it. So another thing I need to do is sort of understand the list of possibilities about, from a system point, how we can make this happen, and start some of the discussions with clinics, with some solutions about different ways that other places have done that. So those are two of the big things that I see. These are great questions.
Not seeing any more coming in at the moment. Since we don't have any more questions, I will go ahead and close the webinar momentarily, Dr. Shepherd-Banigan. Attendees, when I do so, a short survey will pop up. Please take a few moments and provide answers to those questions. We do review them and send them to our presenters, and we count on them to continue to bring you high-quality cyber seminars such as this one. Dr. Shepherd-Banigan, thank you for your work in the VA, and thank you for preparing and presenting today. And with that, I'll just go ahead and close. Wish everybody a good day.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Bye now.